Brexit. With each passing day, it's come to mean a more disunited kingdom and a more damaged, weaker government. My guest this week here in London is Bernard Jenkin, a leading Brexit campaigner and a Conservative MP. How did Britain get into this crisis, and how's it going to get out of it? Bernard Jenkin, welcome to Conflict Zone. Last summer you said if there's a deadlock in British politics, it's usually resolved with a general election. And if Parliament is determined to block Brexit, Theresa May will have to take the decision back to the people in the form of a general election. Why aren't you pushing for that now? It's high time, isn't it?
That's the usual conventional view of British politics. First of all, there was already a general election since the referendum.
But you put this forward last July.
Yes, I did. But what I was saying was that's the usual way of resolving these things.
So what's wrong with that now? Are you afraid of losing?
I honestly don't think now would be the right time for a general election because we are so close to the 29th of March deadline.
Which could be extended.
And what's more, Parliament has already legislated, democracy has been served, for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union on the 29th of March with or without a withdrawal agreement.
But that could be altered by Act of Parliament.
This could be altered by Act of Parliament. This would be very unusual.
You claimed last week that the Prime Minister, despite the political defeat, the large, huge political defeat she suffered, was now in a very strong position to go back to the EU and tell them to change the agreements so that it's acceptable to the House of Commons. Very strong position, really, having suffered the worst defeat of any Prime Minister in House of Commons history.
But look what's transpired over the weekend. The Prime Minister seems to be going back to the European Union, invited by Angela Merkel, no less, who has said that 50 years from now it would look very strange if we didn't look back and say, well, why couldn't they find a compromise? And I think some kind of compromise is what she needs to find. And a compromise that could bring the DUP back on board, a compromise that would bring a large number of Conservative MPs back on board is still a possibility. And I would invite Angela Merkel to follow up her offer to be compromising.
Why should they look again at the deal when it's said they've already said this is the only deal on offer, so that you can come back again in a couple of months and try to alter it again?
Well, I mean,
there's been no consistency from the British side, has there?
I don't think the British side has negotiated particularly clearly, and I do, to some extent, sympathise with our European partners that Theresa May's government hasn't been very clear because of internal divisions within the government. Parliament has legislated that we're leaving on the 29th of March. Now,
Parliament's been clear about what it doesn't want. As Theresa May herself says, it hasn't been clear about what it does want.
Well, Parliament has so far rejected the withdrawal agreement, but it hasn't rejected the leave date of the 29th of March, and it remains to be seen whether it does so.
But to the EU, there's very little point in negotiating with someone who manifestly does not have a mandate for the deal she's already agreed, let alone anything else in the future.
Well, she has a mandate, as does the House of Commons as a whole, to leave the European Union, to fulfil the referendum result. And as I keep repeating, the law is now quite clear in the United Kingdom and indeed in the European Union. We're leaving on that date. Now, there are people in the House of Commons who are trying to change their decision, change the decision of Parliament. They are assuming that the European Union will automatically provide some extension to Article 50. I imagine the European Union is going to want to ask, what for? Why are you extending Article 50? One of the draft proposals extends Article 50 for 9 months. Do you really want the United Kingdom to take part in the European Union elections to the European Parliament when we're planning to leave the European Union just 9 months later?
So your sympathies are suddenly with them, it seems.
Well, I'm endeavouring to be understanding of the difficulties that we're facing, but I keep repeating, our Parliament has spoken and legislated. Both main parties were elected on the basis of the triggering of Article 50, which set the date for the 29th of March, and that is now implemented in law.
You've been saying that no deal is increasingly attractive, but that's not what you and your Vote Leave colleagues promised the country, was it? I mean, time and again they promised great deals with the EU and everyone else and said they just fall into Britain's lap, didn't they? It turned out to be nonsense, didn't it?
Well, I have to confess that I think it's in the European Union's interests to strike a sensible free trade deal with the United Kingdom, and whether we make that agreement before we leave, which looks rather unlikely now, or after we leave, I believe that that's what will happen. But in the end...
My point is there were a lot of broken promises, weren't there?
Well, the Vote Leave campaign didn't make promises, we were campaigning.
Well, your fellow Brexiter and erstwhile Brexit Secretary, David Davis, constantly boasted that both Britain's exit terms and a new free trade agreement would be wrapped up within the Article 50 time frame. That hasn't gone so well. He said at the end of 2 years, this was in 2016, at the end of 2 years, he said, we will have our deals. You don't have your
Well, I think there was definitely overconfidence there, but I think it wasn't helped by the fact that Theresa May couldn't bring the cabinet together to agree what they were going to ask for, and then started asking for a much more complicated arrangement than I think that President Tusk was originally offering in March last year. And then the whole Irish border question has been confected as a mechanism to try and split the United Kingdom, which in a way that's completely unacceptable. And I don't know why the Prime Minister ever accepted the premise of that discussion.
In 2017, the International Development Secretary Liam Fox told the country, we're going to replicate the 40 EU free trade agreements that exist before we leave the European Union, so we've got no disruption of trade. Believe me, he said, we'll have up to 40 ready for 1 second after midnight in March 2019. Now he says he's only confident about 5. False promises or just lousy predictions?
They are the most important 5, including Switzerland and Norway.
Yeah, they're not 40 fact, though, are they?
But 40. The reason why other countries are not ready, we are ready, the reason why other countries are not ready is because they are convinced by all the propaganda that we're not going to leave on the 29th of March.
Why wasn't any of that risk factored into these brave New World promises?
I think you'll find that the government's position has been made very much more difficult by a large number of MPs saying they support the result of the referendum and want to implement it, and then they're doing their best to be very obstructive. And
but to be unkind, Sir Bernard, this is Project Fantasy on the part of the Leave campaign, wasn't it? I mean, like David Davis's promise in 2016 that the first calling point for a British negotiator won't be Brussels, it will be Berlin to strike the deal. Absolute access for German cars and industrial goods in exchange for a sensible deal on everything else. Well, what's worse, the fact that that didn't happen, or the fact that he simply had no idea that individual EU members can't negotiate bilateral trade deals?
I wonder if Angela Merkel is beginning to be a bit worried that the EU has been allowed to overplay its hand, because if the EU thought it could take the United Kingdom captive in these negotiations, it's finding that is not the case.
But you're not addressing the fact that the British political landscape is littered with these broken promises.
I don't accept their broken promises. I expect the main promise is that we would leave on the 29th of March, and we will leave.
Leave with all the deals that would be the easiest deals in history to acquire.
If we leave on the 29th of March, I have no doubt that those free trade agreements the EU has with other countries will be novated very quickly in order to facilitate trade between the United Kingdom and those countries.
But there was a lot of ignorance on the Leave side, wasn't there? I mean, even among some of the most visible campaigners like Boris Johnson, for instance, when he was questioned on TV last September, turned out he didn't know that Switzerland was in the single market and refused to accept it when he was told that was the case.
Well, I'm not responsible for what Boris has said. We voted to leave.
But you're leading Brexiter and you hear this sort of nonsense come out. Why don't you say it? This is wrong?
The British people deserve the referendum result to be implemented.
They deserve the truth being told them by some of your leading campaigners.
And they deserve the truth, and they don't deserve a whole lot of MPs who say they accept the referendum result and are now campaigning against it. And you know, I do advise our European partners not to overplay their hand. The United Kingdom is becoming more likely by the day to leave on WTO terms, which means it doesn't mean we leave without agreements. The European Union's already made preparations for a WTO Brexit for the United Kingdom. And some, yes, and there are other issues to be resolved. But in the end, I still believe that Mercedes and BMW will want to sell their cars to the United Kingdom tariff-free. But if we need to charge tariffs on their vehicles, so be it.
Well, they've been very quiet about that, haven't they? You've expected the titans of German industry to come forward and support your line, but they haven't done that, have they?
Well, it's quite clear that in Germany, the European Union is seen by the hierarchy as more important than anything else, more important than German jobs, more important than German trade with the United Kingdom. I have to confess I'm a little bit surprised by that, but that's a matter for Germany.
But all you need to do is listen to what they've said. I mean, this was from the industry group, the German industry group, the BDI. Some 7.5% of German exports go to the UK, big number, but 92.5% go somewhere else. So as much as we'd like to uphold good relations with British customers, it's extremely important for us not to alienate other European markets. A valid concern, isn't it?
If that's the way they want to look at it, but I would hope that...
Why does that surprise you?
Well, it doesn't surprise me, because Germany has a very united political culture and is very in favour of the European Union. And as the Article 50 process has been progressing, we've seen the rise of AfD in Germany. We've seen the rise of other right-wing parties across the EU.
What's that got to do with their attitude to
Brexit? It makes the European Union look like a very fragile political project with very tender and vulnerable credibility with populations in other European countries. Happily, we haven't got a right-wing party in this country because our parliamentary system tends to absorb those political and economic shocks.
And yet the EU is more popular in the member countries than it's been in the last 30 years.
Well, let's see what's happened in Italy, for example, where they've elected a very anti-EU government that looks set to defy...
Which just backed down over its budget problems with Brussels.
And you think that's going to lead to peace between the Italian government and Brussels in the long term?
What are you saying? It's going to lead to war?
I suspect it will lead... I suspect the Eurozone in the end will break up because it's unsustainable.
That's a big claim. That's a big claim. Let's look at this no-deal prospect that you think is becoming more and more attractive. The warnings from the head of the WTO himself, Robert Azevedo, said last summer that other countries would look to take advantage of the UK's position, complicating or preventing agreements on some points. The moment that other countries, he said, begin to sense an opportunity to increase market share or increase the quota here or there, they're going to go for that. There'll be a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unpredictability. Do you not give any validity to his warnings?
Well, I think we live in a globalized world where there is intense competition between different member states of the WTO, and he is reflecting that element of uncertainty. But given that most of the world conducts most of its trade on WTO terms or agreements concluded under the WTO framework, it's not unreasonable that the United Kingdom, the sixth largest economy in the world, should avail itself of that framework and seek to do agreements with other countries on that basis.
Well, at the end of October, some 20 countries, including Russia, were reported to be looking to squeeze their own commercial advantage from Brexit. This after they'd blocked an attempt by Liam Fox to fast-track a WTO deal on the UK's terms.
Well,
so the blocking mechanisms are already coming in at the WTO, which you seem to think is going to save and answer all our problems.
I think to describe the WTO as the saviour of all our problems, it does represent a safe haven, a safer haven than probably the withdrawal agreement that we're being offered at the moment. And to that extent, it would be preferable. I repeat, most countries are not in the European Union, they're not in customs unions, they trade across customs frontiers, and they have trading arrangements with other countries which they agree on a bilateral basis, or they join international trading arrangements. And if you listen to the Japanese ambassador the other day on BBC News, he was talking about, yes, their inward investors would prefer us to stay in the single market and the customs union, but he described going on to W terms as, quote, no better than a customs union. Of course, the Japanese car plants in this country import quite a lot of their just-in-time supply lines from outside the EU.
He did say a bit more, actually, on that interview. He said if it's just straight to WTO, which Japan has been trading on with a number of countries, that means that the way they do trade is not the most effective, efficient, frictionless way of manufacturing that they are used to here in the UK, and you can't change it overnight. So this was a pretty clear warning.
That they're used to trading in the UK. They will adapt. I mean, I visited the Honda plant in Swindon recently, where they make the 5-door Civic. Okay, they make the engines there, they assemble the vehicles there. Some 50% of the added value of that car is imported from outside the EU. Just-in-time supply lines crossing customs frontiers, crossing WTO frontiers. It's not impossible.
The Japanese ambassador went on to say that the procedures will have to be in place and therefore some companies will have to suspend operations. Not forever, he said, but for a limited time period. And this will allow them, of course, to see what happens.
Well, if there is disruption, I don't think there would be disruption. We've had very strong assurances.
Well, you brought him into the conversation.
Yeah, yes,
I was just quoting him in full.
Yes, but I mean, I didn't agree with everything he said.
To give the full picture of what he said.
What will happen if we leave on WTO terms? You've had very, very strong assurances from the Dover-Calais ports, for example. Both of them are saying there will be no disruption to. There will be no queuing. They're made provision for the extra checks that need to be made, and there will be very, very few extra checks made, if any at all, apart from the SPS checks that are required under European Community law.
You say this, but there is no other major player that trades with the EU on purely WTO terms, do they? Not the Americans, not the Australians, not the Israelis, not the Swiss. The US has struck agreements all the time with the EU, and a very significant portion of EU-US trade is actually governed by technical agreements, isn't it?
Well, those technical agreements, it would be odd if the European Union doesn't make the same kind of technical agreements that it's prepared to make with other countries with whom it hasn't got a free trade agreement. If you're saying that the EU is promising a punishment Brexit for the United Kingdom to put us in a uniquely disadvantaged place compared to everyone else, I would say that's one of the reasons why people voted to leave the European Union.
The EU has procedures. It's not a common sense arrangement, as Britain's previous ambassador to the EU pointed out. It's not a common sense arrangement. It's a legal order.
Well, I think that's part. If the EU is going to be so doctrinaire as they would damage their own trading relationships with one of their biggest export markets, the United Kingdom, that's one of the reasons people want to leave the European Union, because it's an inflexible and doctrinaire organisation.
If your WTO Brexit is such a good idea, why aren't vast swathes of British industry recommending it? After all, their sole aim is to be profitable and keep the economy functioning, isn't it?
Well, there are quite significant industrialists arguing for
But more
WTO
and more
Brexit.
top companies are predicting damage from Brexit,
Well, Sir James Dyson, J.C. Bamford, these are companies that would be perfectly happy for us to be trading.
We heard
WTO
yesterday the
terms.
most recent survey of boardroom attitudes, which was the so-called Boardroom Bellwether Survey by the ICSA, Governance Institute, found that almost 3/4 of FTSE 350 company secretaries were predicting their firms would be damaged by Brexit, a sharp rise over the 42% who were saying the same thing last summer.
Well, I think they would say that, wouldn't they?
Why?
How many
Why
of them?
would they?
I remember the CBI and all those top industrialists campaigning to be in the exchange rate mechanism at the end of the 1980s and into the 1990s. That cost thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs in the British economy.
So they got one thing wrong.
No, they got the next thing wrong. They wanted to join the euro. They all said we had to join the euro, otherwise they would move investment out of the United Kingdom. They got that wrong. Then they said if we voted to leave, just the vote would be enough to drive the United Kingdom into recession.
So you don't pay any attention to these views at all, do you?
I'm afraid we've got rather worn out by the doom-laden predictions of fat cat businessmen who are concentrating on keeping everything the same instead of adapting to a democratic decision that's been taken by the British people and is going to be.
You talk about the people who are
British
responsible for getting the economy in this country to run fat cat businessmen. So you share Boris Johnson's dismissive attitude to business, where he said screw business.
Our country is not run by big business. Big business has to operate
Can't function without it,
in a democratic framework. And actually, even though we left the exchange rate mechanism, we didn't join the euro. We voted to leave the European Union. Since the vote, the United Kingdom remains the second largest destination for inward investment of any country in the world. And headquarters have been brought to this country by Chanel, by Costa Coffee, Boeing's going to open a new factory, new investments have been made in the motor industry. I don't sense that the despair that some motor industry executives preach is actually reflected in the decisions they're making.
But this is a big gamble, isn't it, in the end? Last summer, your colleague in the European Research Group, Jacob Rees-Mogg, admitted as much when he said, we won't know the full economic consequences for a very long time.
Okay.
Funnily enough, that wasn't on your campaign bus, was it?
How big a gamble is it then? You tell me.
The overwhelming opportunity, he said, is over the next 50 years.
You said this is a big gamble. Tell me how big the gamble is. Well, in the end, what about the Bank of England Governor Mervyn King, who said students of economics looking back at the growth of the British economy will be hard-pressed to find the point at which the United Kingdom left the EU. Because, of course, your whole premise that you are advancing is somehow UK's prosperity is utterly dependent upon one relationship, that relationship we have with the European Union. In fact, we've been increasing our trade with the rest of the world, despite the fact we're not in a single market relationship.
And you have a big promise from the US.
Well, if I may just finish the point, and the trade we've done with the European Union has been declining as a proportion. So since the single market came into existence in 1993, we've grown exports to the European Union by about 18%. We've grown exports to the rest of the world by 70%. How do we do it? We're trading on WTO terms with the rest of the world. We're trading across customs frontiers. The fact is, the future of the United Kingdom does not depend on our future prosperity does not depend on membership of the European Union. The European Union is the slow lane of the developed world. It's the high unemployment, high regulation, high tax, low growth part of the developed world. The rest of the world is growing much faster than the European Union, and that's where our future lies. And the very premise...
China's in the middle of a slowdown.
Oh dear.
China's in the middle of
every short-term trend, we should go out and find every pessimistic short-term trend.
You don't know how long these trends are going to last.
But you don't know what the global economy is going to be like next year. You don't know if the European Union single currency is going to last for another 5 years. You have no idea what's going to happen in the future.
That's why I say.
The fact is,
you don't
in this global economy, no, none of us do.
So this is a big gamble.
Well, it's a gamble staying in. Tell me about what the risks are of staying in. We could finish up bailing out the single currency. Again, and if there's another single currency crisis, we could find ourselves dragged into more and more centralised decision-making and more centralised control.
Bernard Jenkin, the political discourse here has turned bitter and confrontational, hasn't it?
Well, you seem to be an example of it.
Well, last year you said the Chancellor and the Governor of the Bank of England, that you accused them of trashing the future of the country as a propaganda exercise.
Yes.
Striking thing about your language, you don't just disagree with them, you have to impute the worst of all possible motives to what they're doing, knowing that this kind of harsh accusatory language is going to be picked up on social media and used again and embellished. Is there a need to talk about it in these terms?
Well, I think there is a need to combat the endless negative propaganda that somehow this great country cannot cope unless it's tied by an umbilical cord to its European masters.
Is a different view from yours automatically negative propaganda?
Well, they have been using very, very strident and terrifying forecasts. They are actually scenarios based on certain assumptions which exclude, for example, what the government would be likely to do if we leave the European Union without a withdrawal agreement.
But it makes the debate toxic to talk in those terms, doesn't it?
Well, I would say they're toxifying the debate by putting out these scare stories which have so far all proved to be untrue.
What's the long-term effect of all this on the politics here? Country is deeply divided.
Well, I would say that we have
so are the politicians.
I'd say we have a very high-functioning political culture in this country. And I go back to the point, we don't have a rising right wing in this country.
No, but you have death threats and trolling and hateful language, as lots of people do.
I think
you have a big uptick in that since the EU referendum.
I think that's happened in other countries that haven't had referendums and aren't leaving the EU, and even countries outside. It's happening in the United States.
Let's just deal with here at the moment.
Okay, but
the Home Office reported spikes in hate crimes after certain events, it said, such as the EU referendum.
But why should we just concentrate on one country and identify those problems with one issue, leaving the European Union, when these things are happening in other countries And politics is polarising in the United States, it's polarised in other countries within the EU, perhaps much more than in this country. So why is that due to Brexit? Is the rise of the right in Italy and Germany due to Brexit? Come on. Let's have a sensible political debate.
We're talking about Britain here.
OK, let's talk about the United Kingdom.
We're running out of time, so...
What will light the fires of extremism in the United Kingdom is if the politicians turn around to the British people and say, we said you were going to take back control. Well, you're not. The politicians are taking back control, and not to keep Parliament sovereign, your country sovereign, but because we want to leave the power with the European Union. That is what will lead to the kind of backlash in British politics that we all want to avoid.
Jenkin, good to have you on Conflict Zone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.